The Jets' 2022 draft class produced star after star after star. The 2023 draft class is not off to as big of a start, but the players drafted don't necessarily need to be stars for the class to be a success. I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, May 30th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, for many players in the NFL, the biggest improvement they make is between year one and year two. And today we're going to talk about the Jets' sophomore class of 2024. These are the players who were drafted in 2023. And we're going to lay out expectations for them as they enter their second season. Now, this class had a very difficult task because the class of 2022 was a very, very tough act to follow. That was a class where you had both the offensive rookie of the year, Garrett Wilson, and the defensive rookie of the year in Sauce Gardner. And you also had a guy in Breece Hall who suffered an injury, around the middle point of the season, early to middle part of his rookie year. He very well may have won the rookie of the year instead of Garrett Wilson had he not gotten injured. And then you also had a fourth guy, Jermaine Johnson, who had a solid but unspectacular rookie year and ended up making the Pro Bowl in year two. That's a once-in-a-decade draft class if you're lucky. That was never going to be a regular occurrence. Now, of course, you hope you find stars. You hope you find Pro Bowlers, but you're probably not going to find 4 stars in one draft. And a lot of that goes to the Jets having 4 top 40 picks in 2022. Now, to their credit, I don't want to make it all about having early picks because, as we know, you can miss on early picks. And to their credit, the Jets did very well. Jets went 4 for 4 in those picks. But it was never realistic to expect that class to replicate itself in 2023, in part because the draft class of 2023 in the NFL, it was just not a very good draft class. And I'm not saying specifically to the Jets. I'm not saying the Jets drafted bad players. I'm saying collectively, it was viewed as the weakest class overall in a decade. And the first pick in that draft the Jets made at 15th overall was Will McDonald. And it was a pick that raised plenty of eyebrows because all the smart money, or at least what seemed like the smart money, maybe it wasn't so smart, was bet on the Jets drafting an offensive player, in particular a tackle. But there was an early run on tackles. The Jets made a trade. There was the Aaron Rodgers trade, which had them move down from 13 to 15. They missed out on all the tackles. They decided to forego one of the receivers who was available, and they drafted Will McDonald. And this was a pick that was a lightning rod for criticism. There were many, many Jets fans who were upset. There were many, many members of the media who kind of raised an eyebrow. Why would the Jets draft a defensive end? As for me, I was more wait and see on the pick. I think there were a couple of factors that were at play there. Number one, I'm always a believer that you don't draft a guy for year one. I think needs come into play at some point to a degree, but I think people look at the NFL draft and they act like it's all about filling immediate needs, where, as I mentioned earlier, there are many cases where a player improves quite a bit between year one and year two. So you should never focus exclusively on filling immediate needs. But it's also about just the overall quality of the class. I mean, I think that there are a lot of moves teams made in 2023, especially in the first round, that any other year I would have just disagreed with. Some of the running backs who went early. I don't think you typically draft a running back early, but in a class that's just weak, sometimes you have to break the rules a little bit. Sometimes you have to adjust your strategy because if the talent level is not as high as in a typical class, you just have to find talent where it exists. And this goes back to why I was kind of wait and see. I think that Jets took plenty of criticism for not addressing an immediate need, but if Will McDonald turns into a quality player for this team, everybody's going to look back on that pick as a success. And I'll promise you this, nobody's going to look back and say, why did the Jets pick a defensive end? Everybody will forget. This is what tends to happen with these picks. The people have very short memories about these things. They criticize, they have a lot of criticism in the short run about not addressing an immediate need. In the long run, nobody ever looks back and asks what your needs were. They just ask, are the players good? And defensive end's a position where I don't think you can ever have enough talent. There are just certain positions that they're the spots that really drive winning and losing in the NFL. Quarterback's obviously at the very top of the list. Wide receiver, the tackle spot. And then on the defensive side of the ball, you got defensive ends and you've got corner. And a difference-making player at one of these spots, is always worth a pick. The question is, will McDonald be a difference-making player? And in reality, for the pick to be successful, I don't think Will McDonald necessarily needs to be a superstar. A year ago when the Jets made this pick, I kind of looked at players who historically had been drafted around the same spot as McDonald. And what I found was that, the middle of the pack guy who's drafted, in the 15 range, a few picks earlier, a few picks later, the median player gets around 7 to 8 sacks per season. He's probably good for like 5 to 6 years. He has like a 5 to 6 year prime. His best year, he may hit double digits and go to the Pro Bowl. And if a guy does that, typically 7 and 8 sacks, maybe one Pro Bowl bid, one double-digit sack season, he's meeting the expectations because that's what guys who are actually drafted in that range tend to do. Now, for Will McDonald, look, he's obviously not going to have to be the best defensive end on this team. He's not even going to have to be the second best defensive end on this team. If we're talking about the short run, if we're talking about 2024, he needs to fill a role. That role is the third defensive end spot. And that's because the Jets have Hassan Reddick, who's been one of the top pass rushers in the league the last 4 years. It's also because they have Jermaine Johnson, who went to the Pro Bowl a year ago. So McDonald's really the third defensive end. And on a lot of teams, that would really make him a backup. That would be a spot that would not be that significant. Maybe he'd come on the field on third and longs. Maybe they slide one of the defensive ends inside to let his athleticism take over against a less athletic guard or less athletic interior lineman. But for the Jets, as we know, we talk about it all the time. It's practically a cliche when we're talking about a Robert Saleh defense. Jets like to rotate guys in and out. They like to keep their linemen fresh. It's not a bad strategy. You want to have your top guys fresh for the end of the game when you're trying to close out a win, when the other team's offense has the ball for that final drive. You want to make sure your guys are not exhausted. You want to make sure your top guys are not exhausted. But you also want to make sure that you're not losing quality when you put your backups in. When you put your top reserve in, you want to make sure you still have a guy who can get to the quarterback. And Will McDonald kind of had a redshirt year last year. I heard some people compare Will McDonald's rookie year to what Jermaine Johnson did as a rookie. And I don't think that that's really accurate because Jermaine Johnson may not have been the Pro Bowler as a rookie that he was in year 2, but he was still an integral part of the Jets rotation. And I felt like this. I said this. You can go back to what I was saying during the 2022 season. But it felt like, Jermaine Johnson may not have stood out like Sauce Gardner did or like Breece Hall did or like Garrett Wilson did during that rookie season in 2022. But it felt to me like every single week he was on the field, there was at least like one splash play, maybe two, that Jermaine Johnson made you say, wow. Will McDonald was not really a part of the Jets defense in 2023. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's doomed, but it means he's got some work to do. I mean, heading into last season, I was optimistic about Jermaine. Will McDonald, it's not so much that I'm pessimistic about him. It's that I don't really know what to expect. I think the Jets coaching staff drafted him understanding that there was some work to do. There were some technical refinements that needed to be made to his game. The question is how much work they've done with him. How much better is he is? And that's not a question we can answer right now. Unless you're on the coaching staff, you don't really know. We won't know until September once the games begin for real. But I think that if we're talking about expectations for Will McDonald, I think it's clear that, they're looking for a quality season from him at the third defensive end spot, 7-8 sacks. Maybe you want to say he's the third defensive end, so 6 would be good, fine. But, you're looking for a guy who's productive, not necessarily a star. You'd take it, of course, if he wants to be a 10-sack guy, if he wants to, really light it up, that'd be great. But I think if we're talking about what we need from Will McDonald this year, what I laid out, solid season as a pass rusher, 7-8 sacks, maybe 6. And I think you'd be pretty happy with that. A guy who you don't lose a lot when you put him in and he gets plenty of snaps. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the offensive side of the ball. There was one rookie who got extensive playing time last year for the Jets. And in a tough situation, he held up okay. What will the sequel look like for Joe Tippmann? We'll break that down, continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime makes getting tickets even easier and faster. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to your event's start. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views of your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Of course, you got the Rangers in action. They're in the Eastern Conference Finals. against the Florida Panthers, a very tight series. The series is tied after 4 games. Can the Rangers do it? They may need your support at the Garden for Game 5, and Gametime is the best place to find tickets for the Rangers or for any other event. You want to go to the NBA Finals, you can do that. You want to go see one of the local baseball teams, and of course, coming this fall, the New York Jets, Aaron Rodgers and his return to the field. You want to catch plenty of Jets games. Gametime is the place to go. You can save up to 60% buying last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, anything you want. The app is super easy to use. I've used it myself. Just pop open the app on the phone or your mobile device, a couple clicks, and you won't be able to believe the deals you get. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. It's Locked On NFL, one word with no space, for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. If you're a fan of Locked On Jets, check out Locked On Sports Today. You may have Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long, and you probably have to turn down the volume with all the shouting. Well, Locked On Sports Today is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today on Locked On Jets, we're taking a look at the sophomore class of 2024. This is the draft class of 2023. Trying to figure out what good expectations are for the players the Jets drafted a year ago. For many players, the biggest improvement they make is between year 1 and year 2. And it's not that hard to understand why. It's a very difficult transition to go from college to the NFL. In fact, I think frequently the difficulty of the transition is underrated. You think about the obvious things. You're playing against better opponents than you've ever played in the past. If you make the NFL that means you were like a superstar in college. Even the guys who are on practice squads in the NFL are guys who were the best player on the field many weeks in college, or if not the best, they were close to being the best. These are all conference players, guys who their entire lives have been, if not the best player, one of the best players on the field. Now you're going up against everybody you go up against in the NFL has always been one of the best players on the field. They're bigger, they're faster, they're stronger. The playbooks are more complicated. And then there are like the soft factors, moving to a new city, adjusting to life after college, life as a professional, something we all deal with, but not in such a difficult way. Trying to navigate a new life. It's just really, really hard. And it's why there's typically a pretty big adjustment period for players who are drafted. Year 2, you kind of have things under the belt. You understand what it's like to be a pro. You've got a year in your system. You've gotten acclimated to the NFL. It's where a lot of players break out. And I think the Jets would certainly love to see a breakout from the guy they drafted in the second round a year ago, Joe Tippmann. And this time a year ago, Joe Tippmann was not working with the starters. He began the year, in fact, as a backup. And the Jets, did something that I thought at the time was smart before the draft. They brought back Connor McGovern. And it kind of gave them the flexibility to start Tippmann on the bench if he wasn't ready. And Tippmann may not have been ready to start the season. Now, unfortunately, McGovern played pretty poorly and ended up suffering a season-ending injury against the Giants. Tippmann's time on the bench lasted 2 weeks because the Jets had a disaster on their offensive line, and then Dwayne Brown got injured. So Tippmann stepped into the starting lineup as a guard in week 3 against the New England Patriots. And, Tippmann's season was pretty up and down. He himself suffered an injury against the Giants, but by the time he came back, he was the starting center. And I think if things go as planned for the Jets, Tippmann's going to be the starting center for a long time. That center spot's not going to be a position the Jets want to have to worry about for a very long time. And, it's difficult to say, especially in the interior offensive line, there aren't a lot of statistics. But if you look at like the numbers, if you look at like the rushing averages when the Jets ran behind Tippmann, if you look at his pass protection stats, how many pressures he allowed, there were some good games. There were some really promising games. And there were some games that, where he struggled. And, I'd say a couple things about that. Number one, the caveats I laid out about a rookie. Any rookie's going to have games where they have issues. The fact that there were some good games, I think, is an encouraging sign. Number two, I think it's especially encouraging because the rest of the Jets line, let's be honest, last year, for the better part of last year, the Jets offensive line was a complete mess. The Jets, and there are lots of different culprits for that. The Jets had a lot of injuries up front. So it's not just that you're playing backups, it's that you have to reshuffle the line practically every week. And I think we also have to acknowledge the coaching was awful. I mean, Keith Carter is just a bad offensive line coach. I will say that until he's not here anymore. Keith Carter is a lousy offensive line coach. I mean, just listen to what the guys who've played for him have to say. So, the offensive line's a spot where good coaching can help a team navigate around a situation where they have a lot of injuries or they have a lack of talent. Jets did not have that last year. So the fact Tippmann was able to shine, even if he was up and down, the fact he was able to shine, I think, is a positive thing. And I think that, there are reasons the Jets drafted Tippmann in the second round. I think this is a guy, and we know how much Joe Douglas loves the physical tools. You give Joe Douglas a guy with elite physical tools, or you give Joe Douglas a guy, or if you give Joe Douglas the option to draft a guy with elite physical tools, or if you give Joe Douglas the option to draft a guy with a refined skill set, he's going to pick physical tools every time. Joe Douglas is off that Ozzie Newsome tree. That's what, that's the way Baltimore is. Joe Douglas came from the Baltimore organization. They value the physical traits, and their essentially mindset is we can teach guys with physical tools how to play the game. But, if you don't have the physical, if you know how to play the game, you don't have the physical tools. We can't teach the physical tools. And Tippmann's a very, very athletic guy. Very athletic for a center, very big for a center. There was the great GM of the New York Giants during the Parcells era, George Young, there was this theory the Giants had. It was called the planet theory. And essentially what it boiled down to is there are only so many big guys with great movement skills on the planet. So when you have the opportunity to draft one, you do it. And Tippmann, I think, opens up some things for the Jets playing the center position because he's got great mobility. And the run schemes in the NFL are not super complex. There's not a lot of variation. Teams run a handful of plays, except for like Baltimore with Lamar Jackson, where they've really bought into the idea of making the quarterback part of the run game. Most teams only have a handful of plays. And when you have an ability to put a guy who can move at the center position, it just opens up the playbook because, guys on the defensive line, they're kind of used to watching the same plays run over and over. They kind of know like what angles they're going to be hit from on a run play because there's only so many options because most teams can't really move their center that well. And Chip Tippmann's ability to move means that he's going to be able to, kick out guys further down the field. He'll be able to kick out guys at the end of the line. If the Jets pull him, it gives them an advantage. It's one of the advantages. And I'm not, when I say this, believe me, I'm not comparing him to Kevin Mawai. I'm not saying Joe Tippmann is Kevin Mawai, but back in the days when Kevin Mawai was with the Jets, that was something that gave them an advantage because the Jets were able to pull Mawai very frequently, and teams typically can't pull their center. And with Tippmann's movement skills, that brings a lot to the table. But Tippmann adds an extra element because he's big. Mawai was not a super big guy. Mawai was super athletic, but for his day, I don't think he was that big of a center. He just overwhelmed people with their athleticism. Tippmann's also big. He's big and he's athletic. He's got the tools to be an excellent center. And, if you look at the Jets offensive line over the last couple of years, there have been a lot of issues. Fortunately, an area that hasn't been an issue because of Connor McGovern has been center. Before Connor McGovern, there were a lot of years where I think center was one of the top reasons the offense was brutal. And the early years of this podcast was episode after episode of the Jets, me complaining about the Jets, what they've done at center. And you want to talk about Spencer Long or Wesley Johnson or Jonathan Harrison. The Jets did not value the center position. Tippmann, I think, it gives you a hope that maybe you figured it out. Maybe you found a guy who could stick at center. Maybe you found a long-term solution at the center position, and you just don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about the middle of the offensive line constantly being leaky. Now, what are expectations for Tippmann this year? Well, when we talk about centers, they're like defensive end, Will McDonald in the first second. We can talk about sacks. There aren't as many statistics we can point to at the center position. So it's one of those things. It's just like, good center play when you see it. And the hope is that Tippmann is an above average center. If he does that, heck, you have to be very happy with that. Really, I think the hope for Joe Tippmann, I think it's a very reasonable hope, is that he shows that he's going to be your long-term center. And you're just, for the next 6 to 8 years, you're not going to have to worry about the issues the Jets had during the Wesley Johnson days or, the Spencer Long days or the Jonathan Harrison days. Just hope you have solid play at the center position. And if you get that, I think you'll be very happy. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the guys who were drafted later on for the Jets in 2023. I don't think expectations are too high. I don't think all these players are going to work, but there are some things you'd like to see from them, and we'll talk about what they are continuing here on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're setting expectations for the sophomore class of 2024. Jets drafted a number of players a year ago, and I think they had a really tough act to follow. When you follow a class where you draft both rookies of the year and you draft two other high-end players, I mean, you set expectations at an unrealistic level. And the Jets did not get a whole lot from the rookie class a year ago. In 2023, there was a big fall off, and that was to be expected because 2023 rookie class was never going to be as good as 2022. And they really only got significant contributions from one guy, and that's Joe Tippmann. So how about the rest of the players the Jets drafted? So the Jets had a first-round pick in 2023. They had a second-round pick, and they did not have a third-round pick because of a series of trades that they made. They drafted a number of players on day 3 of the draft, however. They picked Carter Warren, a tackle out of Pittsburgh. They drafted Izzy Abanikanda, also out of Pittsburgh, also an offensive player out of Pittsburgh. He was a running back. They drafted Zaire Barnes, a linebacker. They drafted a guy, Jared Bernard-Converse, a defensive back out of LSU. And then they drafted Zach Kuntz, who was a very athletic tight end. Kuntz was a guy who, if you look at the athletic testing, was posted one of the greatest athletic testing performances ever at the tight end position. But as we all know, just being a great athlete doesn't necessarily make you a great football player. So what are the expectations for these guys? I actually think they have a lot in common what the expectations are, because I don't think it's realistic to hope or expect any of these guys to become a starting level player. Now, I think to have a good team, you have to occasionally hit on one of these late round picks beyond what you're expecting. I think any individual player has a low chance of becoming a starter, but you do need to find guys who are day 3 picks who turn into quality starters for your team. So, which of the guys will it be? It's tough to say. I think generally speaking, though, when you're talking about day 3 picks, you're hoping for guys who, first of all, will be quality backups. What would you call a quality backup? I call a quality backup, somebody who, if you suffer a short to medium term injury, if we're talking like a game or 2, or maybe even 3, 4, 5, they can give you credible play. Not necessarily that they're going to be great, but somebody who, is not going to destroy your team. I think you know what I mean. It's, the guys I'm talking about, the guys who may not be spectacular players, but, you're not going to be sunk by putting this guy out there. We've seen enough players who, with the Jets, especially on the offensive side of the ball, when they have to play, the team is sunk. We've seen a lot of them through the years. I don't know why. This was a long time ago, but I don't know why Wayne Hunter is coming to my mind. If you were a Jets fan back in 2011, you know what I'm talking about. The right tackle, Wayne Hunter gave you no shot. You're looking for backups who essentially can steady the fort. Hold the fort while your starter gets healthy. And I think that's the hope. Whether we're talking about Carter Warren. Now, Carter Warren's role is kind of reduced this year. He's only going to have to be the 4th tackle. There was heading into the draft, it looked like he may have to be the swing tackle. Now with the drafting of Olu Fashanu, the emphasis on him has gone down. There's less of a chance he's going to have to play a significant role this year because, if anything happens to Tyron Smith or Morgan Moses, you have Fashanu to put in there at the tackle position. And that increases the odds that Warren would only have to play during a medium-term stretch or a short-term stretch. Of course, injuries can happen, and it's not a guarantee, but the odds of your 4th tackle playing significant snaps are not super high in most cases. And I don't think, even with the Jets' injury risk at the tackle position, I don't think the odds of Warren playing significant snaps are super high. Abanikanda, well, he's going to have some competition. He actually could still win the second running back job. There was a lot of shock when the Jets drafted 2 running backs this year on day 3 of the draft, like Abanikanda's roster spots in jeopardy. And I never understood why that was a surprise. This was a guy he was a day 3 pick a year ago, and he didn't really play that much as a rookie. So that's not a guy I would ever expect to have a guaranteed lock on a roster spot. Is he Abanikanda? What can he do? In theory, he's supposed to have great speed. In the limited time we saw him last year, I'm not sure we got a display of that. But you know what? Look, that doesn't mean he's off the team. He's still got an opportunity. If he goes out and really impresses in training camp, there's going to be a spot for him. He can certainly earn a spot on this team, even if it's as a role player. If we're talking Zaire Barnes, the linebacker spot's pretty full at the moment with CJ Mosley and Quincy Williams. But, can he earn a spot as a special teamer? I think that the thing about the Jets right now with Brant Boyer as their special teams coach is this front office and coaching staff has shown a willingness to really dedicate a couple roster spots to core special teamers. The Jets value special teams, and I have a lot of criticisms about the way the Jets run their roster. I have a lot of criticisms about the way the Jets run their team. I have a lot of criticisms about the Jets' overall philosophies. One thing I do like, though, is that they really do seem to dedicate roster spots to special teamers. Special teams can make a difference. Sometimes it's the hidden yardage that special teams produces that makes a big difference. Flipping field position, giving your offense a short field, giving the other team's offense a long field, or the ability to hit the big field goal, which is really more about kickers than about players you'd bring in on special teams. But I like the fact that Jets value those things. So that's a path for Zaire Barnes to get on the roster. And I view special teams as an opportunity for players to stick around. And essentially, like if you earn one of those special team spots, it gives you an extra time. It buys you time to develop at your natural position. So somebody like Zaire Barnes, is he a great linebacker right now? Probably not. But if he can carve out a role on special teams, it gives him time to develop. It gives him more practice reps as a backup. And perhaps down the line, maybe he can turn into something at the linebacker position. I think in many ways, the same goes for Bernard Converse. The safety position is a spot that's open for the Jets. It's right now it's viewed as one of the weaker spots on the roster for this team. So, I'm not saying Bernard Converse is necessarily going to find a spot, but he's got an opportunity. And Kuntz, well, we know Kuntz is phenomenally athletic. We know he's got all the physical tools in the world. Question is whether he can find the technical refinement. And being a blocker on some special teams unit that may help him find a role. And if not, you hope that he can work on the sidelines. And if anything happens to Tyler Conklin or Jeremy Ruckert, can he fill in? Can he give you anything? Can he maybe learn how to block? Can he produce as a receiver? I don't think the expectation should be too high for these day 3 picks. I think most of them don't really amount to much in this league. If they can give you anything, you're probably pretty happy with it. But of course, teams do need to find contributors on day 3. So I think the hope is, of these guys I mentioned, maybe one of them can turn into a core contributor. A couple can be role players, and it's not really important which one I'm mentioning. As long as it happens in the aggregate, I think the Jets will be pretty happy with what they got. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.